The road stretched endlessly through the Nevada desert, a ribbon of cracked asphalt shimmering under the relentless August sun. Rebecca and Daniel Hartman had been driving for 6 hours straight, their silver sedan cutting through the heat waves that rose from the highway like ghosts. They were heading to California, leaving behind their quiet life in Boulder, Colorado, for what they hoped would be a fresh start. Daniel's new job in San Francisco promised better pay, a bigger apartment, and maybe, finally, the chance to start the family they'd been dreaming about for years. Rebecca rolled down her window, letting the hot wind whip through her auburn hair. She was 32, with laugh lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled at her husband. Daniel, 35, kept both hands on the wheel, his jaw set in concentration as he navigated the empty highway. They'd been married for 8 years, high school sweethearts who'd weathered everything together, from student loans to her father's death to Daniel's layoff 3 years prior. "We should stop soon," Rebecca said, checking the map spread across her lap. This was 2003, before smartphones, before GPS in every car. "There's a town coming up, Harlow Springs, maybe 20 miles. Daniel nodded, his throat dry. They'd finished their last water bottle an hour ago. "Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you." Now, back to the Hartmans' journey. But they never made it to Harlow Springs. When the Hartmans failed to arrive in San Francisco, Daniel's future employer called Rebecca's sister, Amanda, in Boulder. Amanda immediately knew something was wrong. Rebecca always called when they reached a destination. Always. Amanda contacted the California Highway Patrol, who began searching along Interstate 80, the route the couple had planned to take. But there was no sign of the silver sedan, no accident reports, no witnesses who remembered seeing them. Days turned into weeks. Amanda flew to Nevada, plastering missing person flyers on every gas station, diner, and motel wall she could find. The photographs showed Rebecca and Daniel at their farewell party, arms around each other, smiling at the camera with no idea that in 48 hours they would disappear from the face of the earth. The local sheriff, a weathered man named Tom Granger, organized search parties that combed the desert highways, but the vastness of Nevada swallowed their efforts whole. It was like the couple had simply evaporated. The case went cold. Years passed. Amanda never stopped searching, never stopped calling law enforcement agencies across 3 states, never stopped updating the missing persons databases with new information, new theories, new desperate hopes. She married and had 2 children, but her sister's disappearance haunted every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering with an empty chair. Then, in December 2023, 20 years after the Hartmans vanished, Amanda received a phone call that would change everything. A researcher named Dr. Philip Brennan from the Geographic Imaging Institute had been analyzing historical satellite footage for an environmental study when he noticed something unusual in images from August 2003. The photos showed a section of desert approximately 40 miles east of where the Hartmans were last known to be traveling. In the images, taken 2 days after the couple disappeared, there appeared to be a vehicle partially obscured by a rocky outcropping in an area with no roads, no trails, no reason for anyone to be there. Dr. Brennan had cross-referenced the coordinates with missing persons cases from that time period and discovered the Hartmans. He'd spent months enhancing the images, consulting with colleagues, making sure he wasn't seeing things that weren't there. The satellite photos showed something else too, something that made his hands shake when he picked up the phone to call Amanda. There were other shapes in the images, shapes that looked like people, moving around the vehicle over the course of several days. Amanda drove to Nevada the next morning, accompanied by Sheriff Granger, who was now retired but still haunted by the case, and a new team of investigators. Dr. Brennan provided them with detailed maps, GPS coordinates, and printouts of the enhanced satellite images. The location was remote, accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles, in a region locals called the Devil's Anvil for its brutal heat and unforgiving terrain. They found the car on the second day of searching. The silver sedan was barely recognizable, stripped by 2 decades of sandstorms and sun, its paint faded to grey, its windows shattered, its tires long since rotted away. It sat in a shallow canyon, surrounded by red rock formations that rose like ancient sentinels. The vehicle had rolled down an embankment, coming to rest in a position that made it invisible from any existing road or hiking trail. No one would have stumbled upon it by accident, no one except satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above. Amanda stood before the wreck, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. This was real. After 20 years of wondering, of imagining every possible scenario, here was proof that Rebecca and Daniel had been here, in this godforsaken place. But where were their bodies? And what did the satellite images mean about other people being present? The forensic team carefully processed the scene. Inside the sedan, they found personal belongings, luggage, Daniel's wallet, Rebecca's purse with her driver's license still tucked inside. The front windshield had a massive crack, suggesting the vehicle had tumbled down the embankment with significant force. In the trunk, investigators discovered something that made them pause: camping supplies, food wrappers, and empty water containers that appeared to have been arranged deliberately, as if someone had been rationing supplies, trying to survive. But it was what they found 50 yards from the car that truly shocked everyone. Carved into a flat section of sandstone, barely visible under layers of dust and debris, were words scratched with what appeared to be a rock or piece of metal. "Not alone. Help us." The letters were large, desperate, meant to be seen from above. Next to the message were 2 sets of initials, RH and DH. The satellite images took on new, horrifying significance. Dr. Brennan had tracked the shapes in multiple photos taken over a 7-day period. The images suggested that Rebecca and Daniel had survived the initial crash. They'd been alive, trying to signal for help, leaving messages, but they hadn't been alone. The other shapes in the photographs, the ones that had moved around the vehicle, remained unexplained. Sheriff Granger studied the enhanced images late into the night at the motel where the team was staying. He'd been a lawman for 40 years before retiring, and his instincts told him something was deeply wrong about this case. The other figures in the satellite photos didn't move like rescuers or good Samaritans. They circled the area, appeared and disappeared, seemed almost predatory in their movements. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. The search expanded to a half-mile radius around the vehicle. On the 4th day, they found the first grave. It was shallow, hastily dug, covered with rocks to keep animals away. Inside was a man's body, preserved by the dry desert air, identified through dental records as Daniel Hartman. He'd been dead for 20 years, but the body told a story. There were injuries consistent with the car crash, broken ribs, a fractured arm, but also signs that he'd survived for several days afterward. And there was something else, something that made the FBI agents exchange grim looks. Marks on his wrists and ankles, consistent with being restrained. Rebecca's body was found 2 days later, 30 yards from Daniel's grave, buried in similar fashion. The autopsy would later reveal that she'd survived even longer than her husband, perhaps 10 days after the crash. Like Daniel, she showed signs of trauma from the accident, but also evidence of being bound. The medical examiner found defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting she'd fought someone or something in her final days. The question that consumed everyone was simple but terrifying. Who had buried them? Who were the people in the satellite images? And why had they left the Hartmans to die instead of helping them? Amanda demanded answers. She hired private investigators to dig into the history of that section of desert. What they uncovered was a pattern that had been invisible until someone looked closely enough. Over a period of 20 years, spanning from the early 1990s to 2012, at least 7 other people had vanished in a 100-mile radius of where the Hartmans were found. Some were hikers. Some were travelers who'd taken wrong turns. All had disappeared without a trace, their cases growing cold, their families left wondering. The FBI established a task force. They brought in behavioral analysts, forensic anthropologists, and experts in cold cases. The satellite imagery company provided every photograph they had of that region, going back decades. When analysts studied the photos carefully, they found disturbing patterns. The same rock formations appeared in multiple images, but with slight differences, additions, changes that suggested human activity. There were structures, primitive shelters built into the canyon walls, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. A ground team returned to the Devil's Anvil in March 2024, equipped for an extended search. What they found was evidence of habitation, a network of caves and makeshift shelters that had been used intermittently over many years. Inside, they discovered items that didn't belong in the desert. Clothing from different decades, personal effects, ID cards from some of the other missing persons cases. There were also tools, supplies, and most chillingly, journals. The journals belonged to a man named Eugene Caldwell. His driver's license, found in one of the caves, showed he'd been 63 years old in 2001. According to records, Caldwell had been a survivalist who'd disappeared from Reno in 1998, after losing his job and his family in a bitter divorce. He'd apparently decided to live off the grid, making the remote canyon his home. But he hadn't lived alone for long. The journals revealed that Caldwell had encountered other people over the years. Travelers who'd gotten lost, hikers who'd wandered off trails, people like the Hartmans whose vehicles had broken down or crashed in the unforgiving terrain. Instead of helping them, Caldwell had watched them. He'd written about it in his journals with a detached, clinical fascination. He observed how long they survived, how they rationed water, how they tried to signal for help. He called it studying human resilience in extreme conditions. But Caldwell hadn't always been alone in his observations. The journals mentioned others, people he referred to only by initials or nicknames. J came by with supplies. M thinks we should move the watching post. The satellite images, when examined in this new context, suggested that there had been a small group, perhaps 3 or 4 individuals, who'd used the canyon as a base, who'd watched stranded travelers struggle and die, who'd buried the bodies to hide evidence of their presence. The forensic psychologist assigned to the case explained that Caldwell and his associates likely suffered from a combination of extreme antisocial behavior and a twisted sense of survivalist philosophy. They'd convinced themselves that helping these people would somehow compromise their own survival, their own secrecy, or perhaps they'd simply enjoyed watching, had found some dark satisfaction in observing human suffering. The FBI traced the other initials in Caldwell's journals. J was identified as Jacob Porter, a former military veteran who'd gone missing in 2000 and whose remains were eventually found in the canyon system, dead from what appeared to be a heart attack in 2011. M was harder to track, but analysts believed it referred to a woman named Margaret Finn, a drifter with a history of mental illness who'd been seen in Nevada in the early 2000s, but whose current whereabouts were unknown. Eugene Caldwell's fate was revealed in the final entries of his journal, dated September 2012. He'd grown sick, an infection from a cut that had spread, and he'd known he was dying. His last words were a rambling justification for his actions, an insistence that he'd done nothing wrong, that nature was cruel, and he'd simply been a witness to its cruelty. His body was found in the deepest cave, a mummified corpse that had lain undiscovered for over a decade. The Hartmans' final days could now be reconstructed with terrible clarity. They'd been driving through the desert, perhaps taking a shortcut or following misleading directions, when they'd lost control of the vehicle on a washed-out section of unmarked trail. The car had rolled down the embankment, leaving them injured but alive. They'd survived the initial crash, had tried to treat their wounds with the first aid kit from the trunk, had rationed the food and water they'd brought for the trip. And they'd been watched. Caldwell's journal entries from August 2003 described two people, a man and a woman, who'd carved messages in the rocks, who'd spread bright clothing on the ground to make themselves visible from the air, who'd shouted into the vast emptiness, hoping someone would hear. Caldwell had noted their desperation with the same tone someone might use to describe an interesting documentary. He'd watched Daniel weaken from his injuries, watched Rebecca try desperately to keep her husband alive, watched her dig his grave with her bare hands and rocks when he finally died. Rebecca had survived for days after Daniel's death, alone, except for the hidden observers she never knew were there. She'd written a final message, scratching it into the stone with the last of her strength. "Tell Amanda I fought. Tell her I love her." That message had been found beneath years of accumulated sand, preserved by the dry desert air, waiting to be discovered. The revelation that her sister had been watched, that help had been nearby but deliberately withheld, nearly destroyed Amanda. She struggled to understand how human beings could be so cold, so devoid of empathy. The FBI agent assigned to her family's case, a woman named Lisa Torres, who'd seen her share of human cruelty, explained that Caldwell and his associates had likely crossed a psychological threshold where other people ceased to be real to them, where suffering became abstract, something to observe rather than prevent. The task force continued investigating, searching for Margaret Finn. Following up on every lead, they used the satellite imagery to search for other possible victims, finding 3 more grave sites in the canyon system. The remains were identified through DNA and dental records as people who'd vanished between 1999 and 2008. Each family received the terrible closure they'd waited years for, learning that their loved ones had died alone in the desert, watched by people who could have saved them, but chose not to. In June 2024, investigators in Arizona received a tip about a woman matching Margaret Finn's description, living in a homeless encampment outside Phoenix. When police approached her, she ran. They found her 2 days later, and after hours of interrogation, she confessed to being in the canyon with Caldwell and Porter. She claimed she'd never hurt anyone, had just been trying to survive, had been too afraid of Caldwell to leave or help the stranded travelers. Her story was partly true. Her DNA was found at the sites, her fingerprints on some of the items in the caves, but investigators believed she'd been more complicit than she admitted. She was charged with multiple counts of criminally negligent homicide and failure to report deaths. The satellite company that had inadvertently documented these tragedies released a statement about how their technology, designed to monitor environmental changes, had instead revealed a pattern of human evil. Dr. Brennan gave interviews, explaining how random analysis of old images had led to the biggest breakthrough in multiple cold cases. He talked about the importance of reviewing historical data, of looking at familiar things from new angles, of never assuming that old cases were truly unsolvable. Amanda held a memorial service for Rebecca and Daniel in Boulder, bringing their remains home after 20 years in the Nevada desert. Hundreds of people attended, friends from high school, colleagues from their jobs, neighbors who'd watched the search unfold year after year. Amanda spoke about her sister's strength, her love for Daniel, her determination to survive even when hope seemed impossible. She talked about the messages Rebecca had left, the evidence of her fighting spirit, the proof that she'd never given up. The case prompted changes in how missing persons investigations were conducted in remote areas. law enforcement agencies began systematically reviewing satellite imagery for unresolved cases, finding success in several investigations. The technology that had seemed like science fiction in 2003 had become a powerful tool for bringing closure to families, for finding answers that had been hidden in plain sight, visible only from hundreds of miles above. Amanda started a foundation in her sister's name, dedicated to searching for missing persons in remote areas and supporting families dealing with the agony of not knowing. She worked with satellite companies, mapping experts, and forensic specialists to develop protocols for using aerial imagery in cold cases. The Rebecca Hartman Foundation helped locate 17 missing persons in its first 2 years, bringing families the answers they desperately needed. The Devil's Anvil, that remote stretch of Nevada desert, became known to investigators as a crime scene that had operated in full view but remained invisible for 2 decades. The satellite images showed everything: the vehicles, the victims, the watchers, but no one had been looking. It was a reminder that sometimes the evidence is there, waiting to be found, waiting for someone to ask the right questions, to look at the data from a different perspective, to care enough to search for patterns in the noise. 22 years after Rebecca and Daniel Hartman drove into the desert hoping for a new beginning, their story finally had an ending. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted, but it was an ending nonetheless. They'd been found. Their killer, if Eugene Caldwell could be called that, was dead. His accomplice was facing justice. The other victims had been identified, their families notified, their remains returned home. Amanda visited her sister's grave every week, bringing fresh flowers, talking to Rebecca about her children, about the foundation, about how the world had changed since 2003. She talked about how satellite images that once seemed like grainy, meaningless pictures had revealed the truth. She talked about how Rebecca and Daniel had never truly been alone in the desert, how they'd been watched, documented, preserved in digital images that orbited the Earth for 20 years before anyone understood what they were seeing. The case remained a study in contrasts: advanced technology revealing primitive cruelty, modern surveillance uncovering deliberate isolation, global systems solving a crime that had occurred in one of the most remote places in America. It showed that in an age of constant connectivity, people could still vanish, but it also showed that traces remained, that nothing disappeared completely, that somewhere, somehow, evidence existed, waiting to be found. The Hartman's tragedy became a testament to the persistence of those who refuse to stop searching, who believe that every missing person deserves to be found, who understand that closure, even terrible closure, is better than an eternity of questions without answers. Their story, preserved accidentally in satellite photographs taken from space, proved that sometimes the watchers are themselves being watched, that justice can find its way even across 2 decades, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried in the desert, will eventually come to light. The foundation Amanda created became more than just a vehicle for finding missing persons. It became a gathering place for families who understood a particular kind of pain, the agony of not knowing. Every month, support groups met in a community center in Boulder, where people shared their stories, their frustrations with law enforcement, their theories and hopes. Amanda led these meetings with a quiet strength that came from having walked the hardest path and emerged on the other side. Among the families who attended was Victor Ramirez, whose son Marcus had vanished during a camping trip in Montana in 2007. Victor had been searching for 16 years, following every lead, hiking every trail his son might have taken. When he heard about the satellite imagery breakthrough in the Hartman case, he brought boxes of maps and coordinates to Amanda, asking if the same technology could help find Marcus. Amanda connected him with Dr. Brennan, who agreed to analyze historical images of the area where Marcus had last been seen. 3 months later, Dr. Brennan found something. In satellite photos from October 2007, taken 5 days after Marcus was reported missing, there was a heat signature in a ravine 12 miles from the designated camping area. The images showed what appeared to be a person, stationary, in a location that rescue teams had deemed too dangerous to access during the initial search. By the time helicopters could reach the area safely, weeks had passed, and winter storms had covered the terrain in snow. The discovery led to a recovery operation in spring 2025. Victor insisted on being part of the team that hiked into the ravine. They found Marcus's remains at the bottom of a steep cliff, along with his backpack, camera, and a journal he'd kept during his final days. The journal revealed that Marcus had fallen while trying to photograph a golden eagle, had broken his leg in the fall, and had been unable to climb out. He'd survived for nearly a week, rationing his food, drinking from a stream, hoping someone would find him. The last entry in Marcus's journal was dated 6 days after his fall. He'd written about hearing helicopters in the distance, about seeing search planes overhead, about screaming until his voice gave out. He'd been so close to rescue, yet the terrain had made him invisible to the searchers below. If the satellite technology had been applied to his case in 2007, if anyone had thought to check aerial thermal images, he might have been found in time. Victor held his son's journal at the Foundation's next meeting, his hands trembling as he read passages aloud. Marcus had written about his love for his family, his regrets about taking unnecessary risks, his hope that someone would find his body so his parents wouldn't spend their lives wondering. The journal provided Victor with answers, but those answers came 18 years too late. Still, he was grateful. At least now he could bury his son. At least now he knew. The Foundation's work attracted attention from technology companies looking to develop artificial intelligence systems that could scan decades of satellite imagery, identifying patterns that might indicate missing persons cases. One company, Skytrace Analytics, partnered with the Foundation to create an algorithm that flagged unusual thermal signatures, abandoned vehicles, and ground disturbances in remote areas. The system was still imperfect, generating false positives and requiring human review, but it represented a new frontier in search and rescue operations. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit began studying the Caldwell case in depth, trying to understand how someone transitions from survivalist to passive killer. They interviewed Margaret Finn extensively, and her testimony revealed layers of psychological manipulation and moral erosion that had occurred in the desert canyon. Caldwell had apparently started with a philosophy of strict non-interference, arguing that nature should be allowed to take its course without human intervention. Over time, this philosophy had twisted into something darker, a justification for watching people suffer. Finn described how Caldwell had rationalized their inaction. He'd claimed that rescuing people would expose their camp, would bring authorities into the desert, would end their freedom. He'd convinced Finn and Porter that they were conducting important observations about human behavior under extreme stress, that future survivalists could learn from their documentation. He'd kept detailed notes, treating each stranded traveler like a research subject rather than a human being in desperate need of help. The journals revealed that Caldwell had debated helping the Hartmans. In one entry, he'd written about Rebecca's determination, her refusal to give up even after Daniel died. He'd noted that she'd survived longer than he'd expected, had shown remarkable resourcefulness in treating her injuries and finding water, but ultimately, Caldwell had decided that helping her would set a precedent, would obligate him to help others in the future, would compromise his isolation. So he'd watched her die, had documented her final days, and had buried her body to eliminate evidence of his presence. The FBI psychologist who analyzed Caldwell's writings concluded that he'd suffered from a severe antisocial personality disorder, combined with delusional beliefs about his role as an observer of natural selection. He'd convinced himself that he was conducting a form of extreme research, when in reality he was simply a man who'd lost his humanity in the desert, who'd rationalized cruelty as philosophy, who'd chosen isolation over compassion. Margaret Finn's trial began in November 2024 and lasted 6 weeks. Prosecutors argued that she was complicit in at least 9 deaths, that she'd had multiple opportunities to alert authorities or help the stranded travelers, and that her failure to act constituted criminal negligence. Her defense attorneys painted her as a victim of Caldwell's manipulation, a vulnerable woman with mental health issues who'd been psychologically controlled by a charismatic survivalist. Amanda attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, making eye contact with Finn whenever possible. She wanted Finn to see her, to be reminded that the people she'd watched die had families, had loved ones, had futures that were stolen from them. During victim impact statements, Amanda spoke about Rebecca's dreams of becoming a mother, about the nieces and nephews who would never know their aunt, about 20 years of birthday cakes with missing candles, of Christmas mornings with unopened presents, of a lifetime of grief that might have been prevented if Finn had simply made a phone call. The jury deliberated for 3 days before finding Finn guilty on 7 counts of criminally negligent homicide and 2 counts of failure to report a death. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20. As she was led from the courtroom, Finn turned to Amanda and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." Amanda didn't respond. Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry didn't bring Rebecca back. Sorry didn't erase 20 years of wondering and searching and hoping against hope. The media coverage of the trial sparked a national conversation about moral responsibility and the obligation to help others in distress. Legal experts debated whether existing laws adequately addressed situations where someone witnesses suffering but doesn't cause it directly. Philosophers discussed the ethics of non-intervention and whether choosing not to act could be considered as morally culpable as actively causing harm. Dr. Brennan continued his work with the Foundation, training other researchers to identify potential missing persons cases in satellite imagery. He developed a comprehensive guide for analyzing historical photos, teaching people to recognize signs of distress, abandoned vehicles, and human activity in unexpected locations. His methodology was adopted by search and rescue organizations across the country, leading to the resolution of dozens of cold cases. One of the most significant discoveries came in August 2025 when a graduate student using Dr. Brennan's techniques identified a vehicle in satellite images from 2011 in the Utah desert. The vehicle belonged to the Crawford family, parents, and 2 children who'd vanished during a cross-country road trip 14 years earlier. The discovery led to a recovery operation that found the family's remains in a flash flood canyon, providing closure to grandparents who'd spent over